Okay, hi everyone. My name is Colin Reilly and I'm an educational psychologist working at Young Epilepsy. Welcome to Young Epilepsy's Epilepsy at School webinar. Two things before I introduce the speakers. The first thing is we're going to be recording the webinar tonight. So if you want to pop out and get a cup of tea or take a break or go and check on the kids, please feel free to do so. The recording will be on Young Epilepsy's website in the near future. The second thing is, if you have questions, please use the Q&A at the bottom and write your questions, and we will have time at the end of the webinar to look at those questions. Our first speaker tonight is Professor Helen Cross. Helen is the Prince of Wales Chair of Childhood Epilepsy. She's also the president of the International League Against Epilepsy, and she's also the director of the Institute of Child Health. Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this webinar this evening, and I send out a warm welcome to so many of you who have indeed joined. You know, what we're going to be talking about is epilepsy and in children in school. Epilepsy is a condition whereby individuals, not just children, are prone to recurrent epileptic seizures. A change in movement, an epileptic seizure being a change in movement or behaviour, the direct result of a primary change in the electrical activity of the brain. These are therefore often unpredictable, but more importantly probably is that it's a symptom. Epilepsy itself has got many different causes. There are many different types of epilepsy, and so more accurately we should refer to them as the epilepsies, a group of diseases rather than just a single condition. That said, there's been much research to look at the effect of epilepsy on children. Yes, there'll be many different effects depending on the cause, but you know, there's a thought about the impact of seizures, but there are other impacts beyond seizures, not least the effect on learning, the effect on behaviour, whether that's due to the epilepsy or whether that's due to the underlying cause of the epilepsy. It is all tightly integrated, not least perhaps even the effect of ongoing medication that's used to treat the epilepsy. So we've long known that actually academic achievements in the long term of children with epilepsy are reduced that of what may be expected. We know there's high rates of learning difficulties, perhaps behaviour difficulties, and as you will hear as we move through talks this evening, perhaps the rate is much higher than may have been perceived, because it's the fact that it may not have been recognised or looked for in an individual, particularly a child perhaps who may be in mainstream education as opposed to special schooling. But even if we recognise the concern, the problems that they may have beyond the seizures, there's also the indication then about, or the issue perhaps about what we may be able to do about it. What do children require in school in order to achieve optimal academic attainments, and also ongoing support with regard to their education, their emotions, their ongoing behaviour. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce this to the webinar tonight, where all of this will be explored, and in particular the results of a very specific research project, What I Need in School, that has been conducted over the past 2 to 3 years by the team. And so with that, I would like to hand back over to Colin to introduce the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Helen. And I want to sort of set the scene tonight in terms of learning and behaviour in children with epilepsy, and basically pose the question, why is it important to consider learning and behaviour in children with epilepsy, and also talk a little bit about, give you some of the facts and the figures in terms of learning and behaviour in children with epilepsy. This first slide here talks about the factors associated with reduced quality of life in children with epilepsy and their families. And when we looked at this in a research project, we found that 3 of the 4 factors that are associated with reduced quality of life are actually related to learning and behaviour in school. So cognitive impairment or learning difficulties, emotional and behavioural difficulties, and school attendance difficulties. So those factors contribute to reduced quality of life in children with epilepsy. The other factor was having seizures before 24 months of age. So this highlights that learning and behaviour are very important to consider in children with epilepsy. Another fact that's important to consider is cost. You know, what drives costs in childhood epilepsy? What are the main costs in terms of health, social care, and education? And this figure here shows you that in terms of the total cost, the main cost is actually social care and education costs at £13,095 over an 18-month period. And actually direct health costs, so looking at things like medication, hospital visits, investigations, was only £3,407. So this highlights that actually cost in childhood epilepsy is driven by social care, so things like respite care, and education costs, so costs like special schooling, support in schools. In terms of the most common difficulties children with epilepsy often have, here is a sort of a figure that depicts what they are. Children with epilepsy have an increased risk for autism, ADHD, emotional and behavioural difficulties, cognitive or learning problems such as memory and processing speed problems, motor difficulties, and speech and language problems. So in order to determine how often children with epilepsy have these problems, we conducted a study in 2014 called the CHESS study with epilepsy in Sussex schools. This was a study population-based, so we wanted to include all children with epilepsy in a certain geographical area. 85 children took part in the study, and we assessed their cognition, so global cognition and specific cognition. So their general level of ability, but also specific things like memory and processing speed. We looked at autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, developmental coordination disorder, so children who have coordination problems, depression and anxiety, and also difficulties with academic achievement. So what did we find? How often do children with epilepsy have these, firstly, behavioural problems? So if you look at the light blue line here in the figure, you can see on the left-hand side, 60% of children with epilepsy need DSM disorder. So DSM is a psychiatric diagnosis manual. But what's also interesting, even though 60% of children with epilepsy had a psychiatric diagnosis or a behavioural diagnosis, only 20% had been previously diagnosed. You might wonder what the rate is in the general population, and approximately only 10% in the general population. So there's a very big difference between 60% and 10%. And it was the same no matter what particular behavioural disorder we looked at. We looked at autism, 21% had autism, only 8% were previously diagnosed, and only 1% of children in the general population are autistic. The same with ADHD, 33% had a diagnosis of ADHD in our study, so 33% of children with epilepsy, and again, only 15% had been diagnosed previously. So it's the same for DCD, developmental coordination disorder, depression, and anxiety. If we look at cognitive difficulties or more broadly, learning difficulties, 40% of children with epilepsy in the CHESS study had a learning disability. We also use the term intellectual disability. And again, approximately 2% of children without epilepsy would have that diagnosis. It's important to say, even those who did not have learning disability often had specific difficulties with memory, processing speed, impacting significantly on school performance. And just to give you some figures in terms of memory, 58% of children in the CHESS study had memory performance lower than their general ability. So their memory was worse than you would expect based on their general ability. And we also found that processing speed was the lowest of all areas in terms of the children with epilepsy's profile, suggesting that they often need extra time for learning and need extra time to respond. So if we look at difficulties with attention, and attention is probably the most frequent difficulty children with epilepsy have. And in the CHESS study, 80% of children had concerns expressed by their parents regarding attention and concentration. And in terms of ADHD, more children had difficulties with attention and concentration and focus compared with hyperactivity and impulsivity. So that tends to be the pattern we see in children with epilepsy, difficulties with attention and not so much with hyperactivity and impulsivity, even though children may have those difficulties. In total, 1 in 3 children in the CHESS study had an ADHD diagnosis. It affected boys and girls equally, unlike in the general population, where more boys have ADHD. And even for many children who didn't actually have the full criteria for ADHD, they often had difficulties in school. And we also know that ADHD medication can help children with epilepsy, but they will also need supports in school. So if we look at autism, 21% of children with epilepsy had autism or were autistic. And again, it's about 1% of the general population. The strongest predictor of having autism in this study was having a learning disability. But even for children without a learning disability who had epilepsy, they had an increased risk for social skills difficulties and autism. It's important to say that autism may often be missed in girls, and children with epilepsy often have, as I said, social skill difficulties, even if they don't reach the full criteria for autism. What about depression and anxiety? Again, an increased risk here for children with epilepsy in the CHEST study, with 13% having anxiety, 7% having depression. And the risk for anxiety starts quite early. It can be as young as 4 or 5 for children with epilepsy. And one of the most frequent types of anxiety is separation anxiety, which you might understand as in parents are often very reluctant to let their children do things on their own because of the risk of seizures or the fear of seizures. In terms of depression, the risk goes up as children reach adolescence, and as they get older, that risk for depression increases. What's likely to help children, and we'll hear some more this evening from our clinical psychologist, Sophie Bennett, but cognitive behavioural therapy may help. And in some cases, particularly for severe depression or anxiety, medication may be needed. It's very important not just to ask parents about the child's anxiety and depression, but to ask the young people themselves, because they often will have a better insight. It may be important to consider medication here as well in terms of both depression and anxiety. Compliance may be an issue, as sometimes particularly teenagers may not want to take their medication, and sometimes epilepsy medications can have a positive effect on depression and anxiety. So it's important to see that the child's actually taking their epilepsy medication, but also important to ask about the side effects, as some medication has side effects which can lead to anxiety and depression. So motor difficulties. So what type of difficulties are often present in children with epilepsy? We know that 10 to 20% of children with epilepsy have cerebral palsy, and that's a group of disorders that affects a person's ability to move and maintain balance and posture. But another difficulty, which isn't perhaps so well known, but is often a problem for children with epilepsy, is difficulties with coordination. So in the CHEST study, 19% of children had a diagnosis of developmental coordination disorder. So that's difficulties with fine and gross motor skills, but most importantly, it's coordination or motor planning that is problematic for children with epilepsy who have DCD. Academic underachievement is also a problem, and Helen already alluded to it. Children with epilepsy often perform under the level you would expect based on their level of intelligence or their cognitive ability. So in the CHEST study, 42% displayed academic underachievement. So that's performance under what you would expect, and that can be in spelling, reading, mathematics, or reading comprehension. And the factors that contribute to that are specific cognitive difficulties such as memory and processing speed, but also school attendance difficulties, highlighting the importance of supporting schools and supporting young people and their parents in terms of attending school. So to summarize, difficulties with learning and behaviour are frequent in children with epilepsy, but they're often not identified, and the children often don't get support, leading to reduced quality of life and indeed educational failure. Children often have difficulties in more than one area, so they might have difficulties with attention, they might have difficulties with memory. The difficulties may be exacerbated by seizures, but seizures or the medications that are used to treat seizures, they're not usually the prime driver of the difficulties. It's usually an underlying condition, so a brain condition that the child has. And on a positive side, there's increasing evidence that the difficulties can be identified, but crucially, the impact of those difficulties can be decreased with support. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Hodder, and Catherine's the Policy and Advocacy Manager at Young Epilepsy, and she's going to talk about the support framework for children with epilepsy. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Colin. We're really pleased to welcome so many families and school staff to the webinar. I just wanted to give a recap of the kind of framework of support that exists across the UK for children with epilepsy in schools. That's going to be different depending on which UK nation you're in, but hopefully we're going to summarise just some of the broad principles that apply, and hopefully that will be helpful for your conversations either with school staff or with families. Let's just move on to the next slide. There we go. So there's many school duties that relate to the well-being and the learning of children with epilepsy, but I just wanted to highlight 3 key areas here. Just to say that supporting children with epilepsy at school is relevant to safeguarding, it's relevant to equality, and obviously it's relevant to those specific duties and guidance related to medical conditions. So in terms of safeguarding, at that basic level, it's about making sure that that child's health doesn't deteriorate, that they've got the support they need to maintain or even improve their level of health. In terms of equality, it's about making sure that because that child has epilepsy, they're actually protected from disability discrimination. So it's making sure that they've got the same opportunities as other children. And it's also worth knowing that schools, similar to other bodies, have to take reasonable steps known as reasonable adjustments to make sure that children with epilepsy aren't put at a particular disadvantage compared to other students. In terms of specific guidance and duties around medical conditions, that's different depending on each UK nation, but there's guidance for each of those, and you can find that on our guide for schools. And in England, state schools have a specific legal duty to support pupils at schools with medical conditions. So I'm just going to really briefly take you through kind of these 4 key elements of support at school that, as I say, will hopefully be useful for your conversations. Firstly, it's about having a policy in place on supporting children with health conditions. Secondly, it's about the use of individual healthcare plans for all children with epilepsy, even if their seizures are under control. Thirdly, it's about that importance of working together with families and healthcare teams. And fourthly, just want to touch on the importance of training for school staff. So firstly, when we talk about a policy, we're talking about a written document that explains the school's arrangements for supporting children with health conditions, and obviously that would include children with epilepsy. And we would say that it's best practice if schools can publish those on their websites so that families are able to see kind of what to expect, how particular schools might manage their processes. That policy should explain how children will be supported so that they can access the same opportunities as other children. And that includes not just sitting in the classroom, but also access to the playground, to sports, school trips, that sort of thing. And it's also important that it's not just about the delivery of medication if needed, or just seizure first aid. It's also about thinking more holistically about that child's needs. I know so all of the school staff will be thinking holistically about that child's needs and how their condition might be affecting their learning. So in England, it's advised that schools should include examples of unacceptable practice in your policy, and in other schools might also find it useful to include this. So examples of what wouldn't be helpful to support a child with epilepsy would be preventing a child from accessing their medication, requiring and expecting parents to come into school or accompany their child on visits. We do still hear about that happening. Needlessly sending a child home. So that will vary depending on the child and what they might need. Sometimes they might not need to go home. And also penalising a child for absences relating to their condition. So, for example, there might be some sort of reward for 100% attendance, but a child with epilepsy may not be able to attain that. So how can you help them access the same opportunity? So secondly, and this is probably the most important point really, about individual healthcare plans. These are so important. So every young person with epilepsy should have an individual healthcare plan at school. It may be that they have a healthcare plan set out by their healthcare professionals. And what we're talking about here is the healthcare plan about support arrangements for them at school. And that might tie in with their medical care plan as well. It sets out the information about their condition and also the support they need to be safe as well as included at school. It should include key information, such as what to do in emergency, but also support for the child's educational, social and emotional needs. So it should be specific, so who's going to do what, and when are they going to do it. And what's really important as well is that healthcare professionals, parents and young people are involved in that discussion about setting out what the plan might be to support that young person. So the third principle is around working together with families and healthcare teams. So it's about the importance of communication between all these different people, between the school, could be the Senko and the class teacher, the teaching assistant, along with their healthcare teams. They might have an epilepsy specialist nurse, GP, paediatrician, as well as the families, so the young person themselves and parents. It's really important that the young people themselves are involved in discussions about their support needs in one way or another. It could be directly, or it might be, for example, the parent talking to the child about that. And also the importance of ongoing communication. So it's not, we don't want it to be, oh, we've set up the individual healthcare plan and then there's nothing more to communicate. If, for example, you're the parent of a child with epilepsy, it's really important to keep your child's teachers informed if there's a change in your child's seizure activity, or if you're concerned about something, and keep that communication going back and forth. And lots of different schools have different ways that you can do that. The school nursing team may be able to provide assistance, and also other healthcare professionals, including GPs, paediatricians, and epilepsy specialist nurses. And in the framework in England, there are also roles called designated medical or clinical officers situated within the integrated care systems, who may be able to help connect schools with the relevant healthcare professionals. So fourthly, in terms of training for staff, training can obviously help staff feel more confident, help them have a good understanding of the different ways that epilepsy can affect a young person, as Colin's been speaking about. It can affect children in a really wide variety of ways. We would suggest that training should include things around seizure first aid, also emergency medication, how to deliver that if the child has been prescribed emergency medication, as well as epilepsy's impact on learning. When schools are thinking about training, it's really important to obviously foresee different scenarios. What if a member of staff leaves? What if a member of staff's away on holiday? It's really important that there's enough members of staff trained so that they can deliver that support. Local authorities in your area might be able to provide training for those schools. And also, again, healthcare professionals might be able to help with that. So it's worth asking. So Colin is going to be speaking about the results from the WIN study later in the webinar, but I also wanted to share some early results from a survey that we carried out earlier this year around support in school. So we wanted to find out from families what the 21-22 academic year was like. And this is a few of the top line findings that we found. So 36% of young people with epilepsy didn't get the support they needed for full participation in school life. So that's a significant number. And only just over half had an individual healthcare plan at school, 56%. And for those that did have IHPs, only around a third included how it might affect learning, and a quarter hadn't been reviewed in the past 12 months. And then you can see here, just under a third of young people and parents had seen the school's policy on supporting children with healthcare conditions. And what we'll do is we're hoping to share the full results of that survey in the coming weeks. So keep a lookout for that. And we also have a free guide for schools, which is available on our website. Let's see if the slide changes. There we go. Yeah, so there's further guidance and information on all of these different areas on the guide for schools, and there's also some contact information on there if you have any specific questions. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Very interesting and very important. And as Catherine said, there is information available. If people have questions, and I've seen some people have already started to use the Q&A function, just put them in the Q&A and we'll try our best to answer them tonight or a later date. The next talk is about the What I Need in Schools research project. And this is a project really born out of the need to ask young people, their parents or caregivers and staff about what they feel children with epilepsy actually need in school. So earlier I talked about assessments, I talked about the difficulties children with epilepsy often have, but we wanted to sort of find out what it's actually like in school for young people with epilepsy. So in terms of our objectives, so what were our objectives? We really wanted to get the views of young people, school staff and parents in relation to educational and therapeutic provision and understanding of epilepsy in schools. So where were these children going to school? Where are children with epilepsy going to school? What type of supports do they get? Do they get therapies at school? Do they get therapies outside of school? And we wanted to ask about inclusion and participation of children with epilepsy in school, and also ask the young people in particular about the impact of epilepsy and learning on impact of epilepsy on learning and behavior. So what did we do? Our participants were young people, so children with active epilepsy taking anti-seizure medications, that's ASMs, born between 2003 and 2014, and living in a specific geographical location in the south of England, in West Sussex. 68 children took part between September 2018 and December 2019. So we used interviews and surveys with the children, parents and staff members. So 68 parents took part, 56 school staff, and only 20 young people. The reason primarily being many young people with epilepsy had difficulties actually being interviewed due to learning problems, speech problems, but also anxiety. And we did try to adapt to include them, but it is quite difficult. That's something to bear in mind. All the children underwent psychological assessments, and we also undertook surveys in all of the schools that children were attending. And we analysed all the data using an approach called thematic analysis, which is basically looking for patterns in the data. So if a number of children, for example, said, I have memory problems, we would say that's a common issue children with epilepsy have. They might have attention problems. So we look for patterns in the data. So in terms of the characteristics of the children, 57% were male, 43% female. They were aged between 5 and 16 years. 55% were attending mainstream and 45% attending special school, 59% attending primary and 41% attending secondary. In terms of the diagnosis they had, 16% had ADHD, 25% were autistic or had autism, 9% had developmental coordination disorder, 60% had a learning disability. And in terms of the medication, 66% were taking one medication, monotherapy, and 34% were taking more than one medication for epilepsy, polytherapy. So just a little more information about the children here in terms of their educational and provision. We were interested to find out what do they actually have in terms of supports. 57% had an education and healthcare plan, so similar to the old statements. 68% had an individual healthcare plan. All children with epilepsy should have an individual healthcare plan. 69% had accessed speech and language therapy in the past or currently accessing it. 55% for occupational therapy, 50% for physiotherapy. 53% had underwent psychological assessment. Only 25% had got psychological treatment or support. None of the children had met a psychiatrist for support, and only 9% had been seen for treatment at CAMS, so child and adolescent mental health clinics. And it's interesting, that particular figure is interesting because when we use the SDQ, Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is a measure of child mental health, 65% of the children were at risk of having mental health problems, but only 9%, as I said, had been seen at CAMS. So in terms of the supports or the understanding of and knowledge of epilepsy in schools, more than half of the children, mostly in mainstream, reported at least some of their teachers did not even know they had epilepsy. In terms of knowledge of epilepsy, it was better in special schools and mainstream schools, according to both teachers and school staff. The P values there, so the P there just means that there's a significant difference between mainstream and special schools. Staff in special schools were more knowledgeable about changes in the child's medication than staff in mainstream schools. And that's really important to know when a child's medication changes, because that can lead to behavioural changes, and it's very important to understand why that might have taken place. In terms of training, staff in special schools were much more likely to have received training on all aspects of epilepsy, so seizure management and impacts on learning and behaviour. So again, special schools are getting more support in terms of supporting children with epilepsy. So in terms of accessing educational and therapeutic supports, we asked parents, how did the process go? And you can see some comments here. It was a really long process, difficult process. You had to explain yourself over and over again. However, parents of a child attending special school felt that actually things worked quite smoothly there. It seems to be quite seamless, and it's just sort of the facilities are there. Everybody knows her. They can automatically just schedule stuff. So there is a difference there as well. And other parents saying it is quite difficult, and it is a bit of a struggle. So a lot of busting down doors and banging on doors. So there is difficulties in accessing educational and therapeutic supports, according to the parents. Parents often felt they had to drive the process themselves and did not get support, not just from school, but from the sort of hospital or the sort of medical professionals as well. And many parents wanted more resources, particularly for the identification of learning and behavioural needs, which they felt their child had. So in terms of inclusion, we'll start off with looking at school attendance, and 41% of parents were concerned about their child's attendance, and they had difficulties due to seizures, hospital appointments, and a lack of confidence in the school to manage the seizures were the main reasons for attendance difficulties. So it's seizures, but also going to the hospital, and also some parents feeling, I don't feel confident sending my child to school. Staff in mainstream schools are more concerned about the child's attendance than staff in special schools. And parents and staff cited a number of negative aspects of attendance difficulties that happen so often for children with epilepsy, including social, emotional, and academic aspects. So one might expect academic difficulties due to attendance difficulties, but both parents and teachers commented on the attendance difficulties can also contribute significantly to emotional problems. So one teacher said the child is anxious on return to school due to not being sure about what's being missed, so an increase in anxiety. The child can have difficulty forming relationships when they miss time at school. Parents said she does not feel part of the class. Another parent says they lack confidence. So they're missing out in school and they feel different. So in terms of supports and other aspects of inclusion, the majority of parents and staff felt the young people with epilepsy were included to the same extent as peers, but often needed adaptations or adjustments. That's positive, but there is a need for adaptations and adjustments. So examples might be of accommodations. The parent must go on school trips. Children can do physical education or physical activity, but only certain activities. And again, it's parents in special schools who are more positive about inclusion than parents of children attending mainstream schools. And we also asked why children might be excluded from certain activities. And sometimes it was the children themselves. The child just wasn't interested. So we described this as child-led exclusion. But sometimes it was staff, the child's behavioural difficulties or their epilepsy meant it was difficult to include them in certain activities. And sometimes the child was isolated, the child with epilepsy was isolated or deliberately not included by peers. Yeah, and another thing that we asked the young people about was about restrictions, and asked their parents as well. Are there particular restrictions you feel that are imposed on you because of your epilepsy? And the children gave many examples. Sleepovers with friends often require consideration or adjustment, or may not happen at all. There's limitations regarding physical activities or sport. The child's unable to be alone or accompanied, which can really affect children, particularly in those teenage years when they want to sort of form their own identity and go out on their own. There was regarding photosensitivity. Even though the majority of children often don't have photosensitivity, a lot of schools felt, they can't go to a disco or particular lights might affect the child, even though that child may not have that particular difficulty. And children were often excluded out of some out-of-school activities as organisations, for example, sporting clubs, did not feel they could accommodate the child with epilepsy. So many restrictions and limitations faced by children with epilepsy. In terms of bullying or friendship, what was interesting, even though many children with epilepsy reported that they had been bullied, most did not feel that this was due to epilepsy. And the same for parents. They reported that 40% of parents believed that their child was bullied for reasons other than epilepsy, and only 9% thought it was due to epilepsy. In terms of bullying, parents of children in mainstream schools were likely to agree that their child was bullied because of their epilepsy and non-epilepsy reasons compared to parents in special schools. So what that means is that parents of children going to special schools believe that their child is more often a victim of bullying than children attending special schools. And most parents thought that their child had difficulties making friends, but again, it was for reasons other than epilepsy. So again, the learning and behavioural reasons might come in here. Yeah, and we also asked young people about the impact of epilepsy on learning and behaviour. And as I've already talked about earlier tonight, we know that this is a big issue. And young people agreed they perceived that epilepsy affected specific aspects of learning, such as memory, attention and concentration, but also physical and emotional well-being, including increased tiredness and lowered self-confidence. So not just sort of learning, but also emotional aspects as well. Young people also brought up the possible negative effects of anti-seizure medications, ASMs, including increased irritability, impact on appetite, and emotional reactivity. So children felt that a side effect of a medication could lead them to be more, angry, for example. The young people also mentioned that epilepsy in school was associated with stigma, so the embarrassment of having a seizure, or even people finding out that they had epilepsy. So that stigma or negative attitude is unfortunately still there. So in terms of supports, most parents agreed or were satisfied overall with the supports their child received in schools. That's really positive. Many parents were quite pleased with the level of supports their children were receiving in schools. Again, there was a difference between special schools and mainstream schools, with parents of children attending special schools being more satisfied. In terms of staff did say that they were often unsure whether or not their child's ASMs, that are medications, affected learning and behaviour. So a clear need for staff to understand when a child's medication changes, but also how medication may affect learning and behaviour. And I think this is probably the most important slide from this particular research study. It's basically, we asked young people, what supports do you want in school? And we broke it up into different themes and sub-themes. One of the things that they would like is access to specific support environments. So out of class support, the opportunity to leave the classroom and access support in a more relaxing or less distractible environment. Access to a medical room, for example, after a seizure, but also the opportunity to remove themselves from triggering environments or situations. Now it's too much for me. Now I want to be able to leave the classroom and be allowed to do so. In terms of accommodations, they want additional time for tasks and tests and be able to use a laptop instead of writing with a pen and paper. They want increased adult support, to be supported in the classroom by a staff member, to have the opportunity to work in smaller groups as opposed to the big classroom. And they want the teacher to come and check that they actually have understood instructions before activity starts. Another thing they mentioned is having access to somebody in the school who they trusted. That could be a friend, but also a teacher or familiar staff member who could act as a mentor. So having someone there to sort of talk about how it's going for them in school is really important. In our educational staff survey, so we surveyed all staff in the schools where the children with epilepsy were attending, and a good number of them responded. And I just take out some of the main findings. Half of those responded would not feel confident managing a child having a seizure at school, despite the fact that all of the schools had children with epilepsy attending. 73% of staff would like further training on epilepsy, training on recognizing seizures, managing seizures, epilepsy and learning, and epilepsy and behavior. And it's really important that we help teachers, we help schools and support them in terms of supporting young people with epilepsy. And this is one of the final slides from this study, and it's sobering because it shows that the dark blue line there is familiarity with conditions, and we gave staff a list of 8 conditions: autism, asthma, ADHD, diabetes, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, dyslexia, and Down syndrome. We asked them, how familiar are you with these conditions? And the conditions that they were most familiar with were dyslexia, autism, and asthma, and epilepsy somewhere in the middle. But the light blue line is perhaps more worrying, or it is more worrying and more important in some respects. It's how concerned would they be if a child with one of these conditions came to their class? And the condition where staff expressed most concern was epilepsy, unfortunately. And these are schools where children with epilepsy are already attending. So of those 8 conditions, epilepsy is the most concerning to staff in schools. And I think that is important to consider in terms of the needs of kids with epilepsy in schools. To summarize, young people perceive epilepsy as having an impact on their learning, but also their psychological well-being, and it is unfortunately still associated with stigma. Identification difficulty, perceived knowledge of school staff and training is better in special schools than mainstream schools. Many staff members are unaware of the link between epilepsy and learning and behaviour difficulties, and that makes it more difficult to actually identify and support the young people. Parents indicate difficulties at accessing educational and therapeutic supports, and sometimes that might be due to the emphasis being on the child's epilepsy, and the child's learning and behaviour issues may not get as much attention or support. And school staff would like more training in all aspects of epilepsy, and that's something we really need to consider, how best we can support staff. Just to finish up, what really is needed in schools based on the findings of the What I Need in Schools study, the WIN study. How can young people be better supported? It's very important to follow up and assess their educational needs early on. They need an access to a trusted person in school, and they need, teachers and staff who are aware of their epilepsy. In terms of parents cannot be the only advocates. They support from professionals who can come to schools. So it's not just those in school, but children with epilepsy and parents, they need a professional, so a medical professional, to come to schools and explain what epilepsy is. Teachers lack knowledge, have concerns about epilepsy, and want training. So the question is, how can we best achieve this? How can we increase their knowledge and improve attitudes towards epilepsy? And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. This is our research team, the WIN study, and we would like to thank the sponsors and funders of our study as well. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is a young person with epilepsy, Clara.
Is that all right?
Perfect, Clara.
Okay, so a little about me. I'm 16 currently, and I had my first seizure in October 2019, so quite a while ago now. And I was diagnosed on the 31st of December. So it actually took me quite a while for the doctors to find out what was causing the seizures. And for this main reason was because I was diagnosed with drug-resistant epilepsy, because I tried a lot of tablets and they just weren't working for me. This is the medication I'm currently on. And I have been, these are the other medications I've been on that have made my epilepsy drug resistant. And I was on the ketogenic diet. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but it honestly was really, really difficult for me just because it was so restrictive. And I was referred to Adam Brooks because of this drug resistant, because nobody knew what was happening. And now back to the main bit. So what worked for me at school? So chats with the nurse. My whole year group had a chat with the nurse about my epilepsy, and this really helped because everyone understood the situation. Like I would have told them and everything, but having a proper chat with all my classmates made it more real and realized. So they realized what to do and understand, and they got taught what would happen if they found me in that situation. I wasn't there on the chat, and this again made it more severe to them, because they knew like I was affected by it, and it was a real challenge and is a real issue. And this has just been discussed, but I had a care plan at school, and this was put together by my doctor's nurse. So basically my mum just asked my doctor, and then my nurse and my mum worked kind of side on side, and we did emails. I think my mum went to Adam Brooks as well to create the care plan. And this is really helpful, as this has been discussed, that teachers know what to do and they know what the plan is, making my parents feel even more safe. Communication also really helped me at school. So lots and lots and lots of emails from my mum and my dad to school, because every time seizure happened, something either went wrong, right, or something could be improved. Any worries were soon addressed by me or the school, because obviously something could go badly wrong if my care plan wasn't properly in place or people didn't know what to do. School compromises. Now, this is a big thing, and I've recently changed schools, and it's taken a long time for my new school to kind of adapt, because I made big compromises. So one of my triggers as such was I have my seizures when I'm tired, and especially in the mornings. So we made a compromise with my school that I wouldn't come in for registration. So instead of coming in at 8:30, I would come at 9. So if it was just half an hour more sleep, but if that is what keeps me doing the whole day at school, then that's what we did. And that was really helpful. And Zoom lessons, we just had COVID when I had my first seizure, so Zoom lessons were still up in the air. But post seizure, because obviously towards the end of the day, if I had one in the morning, I was sort of feeling up to having lessons, so I could do that. And then revision sessions, especially heading into my GCSE years, having to catch up on sessions I missed was really hard, but the teachers knew that I had to catch up, so they made a compromise to do revision sessions outside and inside of school. So that really helped as well. But I think with these school compromises it's just being really open with the school and knowing that like your child or the pupil comes first in the session, you know, they come first, especially if, so I had special access arrangements for all my exams in school. So for example, extra time. So I applied for this just via my doctor. My mum literally just said, is Clara entitled to extra time? And my doctor went, yeah, of course she is. And then he just wrote a notice to the exam board, and then I was given extra time and the ability to type in my exams. And especially in GCSEs, this was really helpful. And I would advise like everyone, I swear, if you're a pupil to do this, because it was so useful. And like has just been discussed about the cognitive process and things, it's a lot slower. And knowing that if you go talk to exam boards, you are qualified for the extra time. So you're equal to everyone else. But that, honestly, that was amazing for me. And this was a huge thing. I had to adapt. I had to find the courage to not be afraid of it, speak up about it. And the people around me had to do that as well. Like, they had to get used to it. Like if a seizure happened, people couldn't go shy about it. They had to have the courage to be fine about it, be supportive to me. And at the end of the day, it's not going away, and I had to be confident about it. And that's the only way that got me through school, really. Like, it's not going to go away. I might as well talk about it. I might as well get everything I can, extra time, everything, because it's not going to go away. I'm stuck with it. And this quote is still, my parents actually said this to me, put yourself in their shoes. And this, I say this all the time to myself, because if a seizure were to happen and I don't know, you know, like nobody were to know about it, no pupils were to know, put yourself in their shoes. How would they feel if they didn't know you were epileptic or anything like this? So every time I'm in school or I'm in a situation, I put myself in the people around me shoes to see what would they feel if I saw this seizure happen, not knowing what to do. So what were the challenges at school? This one, my mental health, you know, emotionally very hard. I'm now 14 months seizure free, nearly 15, and I'm still panicked and anxious. That I don't think that's ever going to go away, just because of how the past was and just how hard it was every seizure, really. I'm constantly on a roller coaster of emotions. And what will happen? Am I safe? What will the next seizure bring? Balanced with trying to be a teenager doing my GCSEs, being a young adult, trying to do friendship groups. And these things could have contradicted themselves, like going on a roller coaster with all my friends. I couldn't do that. So things like this contradicting themselves, and that this was a real challenge for me at school. Learning, and again, this has just been discussed, but remembering things was so difficult. And because of the amount of medication I was on, and previously because I was drug resistant, the Keppra, which I first took, really messed with my head. And I literally can't remember year 9, and I missed so many lessons, and I was missing lessons from doctor's appointments, and it was just a real challenge for me. Like I just said, I have no memory of year 9 and 10. So it was not helpful at GCSEs because I had to teach myself a lot of things. And this was so confusing to teachers. They couldn't get their heads around it. You know, how could I not understand 2 years of learning? Like, I was in the classrooms, I was there, I was in the lessons. But mentally and like physically, I wasn't. I was either recovering from seizure or the medication was messing with my head. So, and all of this, it was clear I did feel left out. I wasn't at school at some times, and yeah, it does make you feel left out. If you can't remember things, you obviously get behind, and so you get behind in lessons, so you automatically feel left out. School in general, missing lessons, don't know things, miss sports. This was a huge thing because I'm a really sporty person, and having that slowly stripped away from me was really challenging. And teachers never, especially in my school, they kind of forgot, because I was still trying sports. I was just still trying to get on with my life. So they kind of forgot about certain elements of it. And it was, like I said, hard for them to understand what was going on, because even though I was taking part in things, it almost seemed like it wasn't that much of a big deal, even though they had been given the care plan and things like this. If I was going on with my life, surely it can't be that bad. But obviously, it's completely different to that. Some of the things in school weren't safe, especially in sport. Like, of course, things are going to be difficult when you have a brain that could go off and produce this immense seizure in any minute. And I actually had my first major injury during a sport at school, and I was doing rounders. And I think this is when my peers and my family finally realized how dangerous epilepsy actually is. And yeah, so this was me, this glamorous photo of me. After rounders, I was playing, and I had a seizure midway through running and grated my face on grass. So this was just a challenge, because everything's so restrictive and everything you have to think about constantly. Sports, school, what could happen, and protect yourself from those things. And the embarrassment of people seeing me, I personally call it an ugly state, was very difficult mentally and for the rest of my peers, because obviously after a seizure, when you're recovering during it, you don't look the best. And especially as a teenager, it's hard for me to accept that, I don't look the best after a seizure. And it was difficult. What did I do not at school? So I used to be a very keen swimmer, and I attended England camps. I competed at British level. I was a regional champion, a country champion. And so here are 2 pictures of me. So yeah, the one at the top is me in my club kit, and the bottom one is when I went to Glasgow, and I was the second fastest 13-year-old in Britain at 50 freestyle. And that's me in lane 2. And swimming was my life. I used to swim 6 times a week, and I loved it. However, epilepsy stepped its foot in the door and I had a seizure in the pool, which was terrifying for everyone around me, for me. And not only, and I also had my second injury at the pool as I slipped on poolside and I hit my eye on the corner of the wall in the pool. So I had a big black eye. And then I kept going with it because I just loved the sport so much. And then I had another one in the pool. And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to have to keep trying this because my friends, my life, it was just it. And then I had another one, and then that finally put an end to it. Because it was just too dangerous and I had to stop. But this was extremely challenging for me because swimming was my fitness, my friends, my life, and the choice of quitting was taken away from me. Just stripped from, just taken away. So mentally as well, it was so hard because I didn't have that option to stop. So something I love so much, I couldn't go, you know what, let's put it to bed. I just had to stop, which is really difficult. So what did I do? So this photo has context to it. I found new interests. What am I supposed to do if I don't do swimming? And I obviously loved loads of other things besides swimming, but not only did I feel like I needed to do something, I wanted to do something. Got involved in my local theatre group. I was already doing drama GCSE, so it wasn't new to me. But I auditioned for the role of Miss Trunchbull in Matilda the musical, and I got the role and I absolutely loved it. So this is me on stage in the centre doing one of my best songs, Smell of Rebellion, and I learned new skills. I rebuilt a lot of my confidence, and it kind of just was like, epilepsy does not define you. Look at I think I performed in front of about 1,000 people overall. Epilepsy didn't stop me doing that. Epilepsy doesn't define you. Do what you want, tackle it. It's not, it's not going away. Do what you want, just, and it shouldn't stop you growing as a person and exploring new things. So this was a huge milestone for me, just because mentally I just realized that I can do this. But yeah. So after this, I also just recently, in the last couple of months, I qualified as a swimming teacher and my level 1 qualification, and I'm also teaching young pupils at my school swimming. So I'm so excited because I've got my love for swimming there, but I'm obviously not swimming, so I'm safe on poolside and there's a lifeguard at hand, so I'm always safe, but I'm still pursuing that love for swimming I always had. And like I just said, it just helped me realize that epilepsy does not define you, and branching out and doing these new things is just steps to moving forward and accepting your diagnosis and getting used to live with it, because it's not going away. So where am I at now? So I've worked really hard for my GCSEs, and I got into a selective sixth form to study history, classics and performing arts, because he couldn't keep me off the theatre for long after that almost seemed revolutionary theatre work I did. And this was a huge achievement for me, because I actually didn't know if I'd be sitting my GCSEs because of the amount of seizures I was having and the lessons I was missed. But I was determined to keep doing them because I didn't want to be a year behind. And like I said, I've changed schools, but I have still many old memories at my old school, but quite a lot of them are shaded, because I had seizures there, and that isn't going to be gone. And yeah, my old school is darkened with the memories of the seizures. I'll be soon applying for university, and I'm already looking for future courses, which is really exciting. So keep pushing towards the future. It's amazing. And I think even if you're younger than I am and can't push that far, just looking into the future to seeing what you possibly could do is also really exciting, because you don't know where the future is going to take you, and especially with epilepsy, you don't know what tomorrow might bring. I am 14 months seizure free, so I kind of feel like I'm at the other side at the moment, which is amazing. And that means I can drive. So on April, my birthday, I'll be able to drive, which is another milestone. And from a person on the other side, it does get better. So here are a few useful websites I've used. So if you want to note any of them down, so they're really good websites. And yeah, that's kind of my closing thing. So whoever you are, a family member of someone who has epilepsy, an epilepsy warrior yourself, a teacher, a teacher with a pupil who is epileptic, it does get better with your diagnosis. May not go away, but use your initiative to carry on and not let epilepsy define you, or the warrior that needs your help. Stay strong, and power is in purple, because purple is the epilepsy color. So keep going. That's the end.
Joe Jackson, Joe's mum to a young man with epilepsy. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Colin. Hello, everybody. I don't know whether this is working, driving this. There it is. Background for me then, as Colin said, I've got a son with epilepsy. He's 15 years old now. He had his first seizure in 2013. Almost fortunately for me, he was out with friends, so I didn't see it, because I don't think I would have reacted particularly well. But he was brought home. We were told what happened. We took him to the local hospital. They checked him over and said he was absolutely fine. We had a few difficulties from then on, because every time we said we've got a problem, you know, he's not doing what we expect him to do, he's having what we think are seizures, they were saying, you know, hospital has checked him out, he's fine. So we ended up at our GP, slightly out of our minds, showed the GP a video. The GP said at that point, oh, so you've got epilepsy in the family, which we don't. Completely new, completely eye-opening. I'm sure as all parents that hear that news, that, you know, your child's got epilepsy, we went away and did every piece of research we possibly could, became, you know, almost experts overnight. And originally we were told that he had Rolandic epilepsy, he would grow out of it when he got to his teenage years. You know, we'll put him on some medication, it'll be absolutely fine. Unfortunately for us, that didn't pan out. His seizure presentation changed, and in 2016, with lots of MRIs and scans and things, they found a physical cause for his seizures. So Rolandic epilepsy, and the idea that he would grow out in his teenage years, was taken off the table, and we started looking at all the different drugs that you can use. Unfortunately, much like Clara, we've been through lots and lots of drugs since 2013. We haven't found anything yet. We're very hopeful that we will, but it's not looking good for us. We went through lots of different options. We looked at the ketogenic diet. As Clara said, it's tricky. We got told it might stunt growth, and we realised it was going to be a massive change, so we didn't go for that. What we did go for is surgery in 2019. So we spent, just before lockdown, a month in Bristol Hospital, probes in the brain, bits of the brain being melted. It's as hardcore as it sounds. It was hard, but it happened. He had the surgery. Unfortunately, it hasn't made any difference for him. And we've been told that we can't do that again. So we're back at looking for drugs to see if we can do anything to help. Schooling, which is what this webinar is about. My son has always attended mainstream primary and now secondary schools. He had his first seizure between years 2 and 3, which in our part of the country is where we moved from infant to primary school. So primary school dealt with the seizures brilliantly, actually. I think it's much easier in primary school because you tend to have one teacher associated with a class. and they know your child really, really well. But communicating with the school, telling them what's going on, letting them know about changes in medication is obviously really important. On the move to secondary school, I used to be a secondary school teacher, so I knew it was going to be a big change, and I made sure the healthcare plan was in place. I made sure that we had had all the meetings with the secondary school about, you know, his care and his seizure presentation, and I almost felt like they didn't believe me that it was real, and almost fortunately for us, he had a seizure on his very first day at secondary school, and they suddenly went, it's real, and started to put everything into place that they needed to, and the healthcare plan was properly taken notice of. Especially at secondary school, and like I said, at primary as well, I think communication as a parent with the school that your child is at is massively important. Like Clara said, parents are always in communication with the school. I think every other day I'm sending messages to say, he's having a good day, he's having a bad day, can you look out for him today? You know, he's got a headache, he's tired, you know, he's had an upset stomach and that might affect his medication uptake. So just constant messaging between tutors. We're really fortunate at our secondary school, which is unusual for our area, that there's a nurse in school from 9 till 3, and she knows my son really, really well, so that even if he's had a bad seizure and he's trying to almost pull the wool over their eyes because he wants to stay in school, she'll say, you know, no, we need to phone mum, she might need to come and get you because he needs lots of sleep after a seizure usually, which they can't really facilitate at school. Like I said, school are brilliant with him. He can do all the things he wants to do. He's very, very sporty. I make sure that if they need me to, I go on school trips. Now that he's got a bit older, they're taking him a bit more often without me. But yeah, the PE staff know him really well. He has particular triggers, which unfortunately for him is anxiety. So being in year 11, the stress of mocks and exams and revision with a poor memory is stressful. One of the things that I found about school, which doesn't work so well, is preparation for adulthood. We're obviously getting towards the sharp end of year 11 now. Careers advice and what you can do in the future seems to be very, if you're in a mainstream school, it seems to be very mainstream advice. I've started looking at having an educational healthcare plan in addition to the individual healthcare plan to look at his memory needs, so that if he does move schools or go to college, that they know from the get-go that he has a memory problem and he will need assistance. I've done a few things looking at preparation for adulthood, been to some sessions, like support sessions for people with epilepsy. Unfortunately, the adults that tend to be at those sessions are really struggling with their epilepsy, and it didn't really help me to think that there was a positive future going forward, but I'm sure there will be, because he's quite a resilient little chap. Wider issues I find with epilepsy is the impact on the family. I have an older son who's healthy, went through the school. While he was at the school, I hadn't even realised that the school nurse was such an essential tool, and the amount of communications that you might need. Things like, simple things like walking to school. My younger son always walked to school with his older brother, and now that his older brother's gone to university, I'm having to take him to school. It's obviously social suicide to walk to school when you're 15 with your mum, so I have to take him in the car, because we've not found a way that we can get him to school walking by himself safely. Public perception of epilepsy is an issue. My son doesn't have what I would call typical epilepsy. When I say to people he's got epilepsy, they seem to think that every now and then he's going to fall on the floor and flop around, and he doesn't do that at all. He has localized seizures, which are much more like a stroke, and his face will drop, his face will move around, and he'll dribble and not be able to speak. Now, some people see that as just somebody being silly, or, you know, they won't see that as an epileptic seizure, which we struggle with, because if you're out and about by yourself as a 15-year-old and you're presenting that image to people and they don't know about your condition, it's difficult for them to know how to help, and it's difficult for my son to know how to ask people to help. Areas of support, again, we've looked at different things. We're looking at education going forward and whether college or staying at school is the right option, how universities deal with epileptics, again, what support there is out there for mental health and things like that. We came to Young Epilepsy through a study that they were doing on physical activity in epilepsy, and because my son's particularly active, he particularly loves badminton and tennis, and I want him to be able to do exactly what he wants to do. We took part in that study, and that's how we came to be aware of Young Epilepsy. But yeah, support, I think it's very dependent on where you are in the country. We're in the southwest and feel quite isolated down here, but there are support groups out there. Like Clara said, there are websites that you can go to ask for help. That's me, done.
Joe, thank you very much for that really interesting, summary of the issues that young people often face, particularly at that time of transition. Our next speaker is Danny Hulme. He's assistant head at St. Piers School, and he's going to talk a little bit about epilepsy from the point of view of teachers or school staff. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you, Colin. First of all, good evening, everybody. My name is Danny Hulme, and as Colin said, I'm assistant head of St. Piers School. I started working at St. Piers, which is part of Young Epilepsy, which I'll come to in a second. I started working there in 2006, so I've had quite a few years of experience. I've had a number of different roles within the school, including a support worker, teacher, and phase leads. And now I'm assistant head as well, so I've got a wealth of experience to go on and lots of experiences to be able to speak about. So St. Piers. Oh, sorry, skipping the slides too quickly. So St. Piers is a part of the wider Young Epilepsy charity and provides education, therapy and residential care to a number of students from across different local authorities across the country. So we work with a wide range of different local authorities. So we have seen differences in their approaches to epilepsy and how it can impact on our young people. There is obviously the link there below to find out a bit more about our school and what we do. We've got a rich history, 150 years we're celebrating this year as a school. And as part of the charity of Young Epilepsy. So I thought the best way to go about this webinar would be to get those first-hand experiences, to share them with my own and get those views of the staff that I work with in the school as well. So when I asked a large part of our staff team what they thought it was like to teach children with children or young people with epilepsy, there was quite a mixed reaction. So you can see there from some of the quotes, very interesting. It's given me the ability to understand the complexities of psychology and how the impact of the brain functioning can have on learning. And I think that's really interesting. I think we've heard others mention about that today as well, how that brain functioning and processing can have a real impact on some of our young people. It doesn't tend to be part of your initial teacher training or anything like that. So it's really opened our eyes as teachers and professionals working with our young people that there is a massive impact that epilepsy can have on their cognition, their functioning and their processing. The second quote there, the first time I managed a seizure was terrifying. That was a word that came up quite a lot, as I'm sure you've heard this evening. It's been mentioned a few times. I made every effort to get to know the students personally and really understand what their epilepsy meant to them. And this teacher felt so much more confident when managing seizures now that she didn't have the fear that she used to. And when we elaborated on that, it was fundamentally down to training, whether that was self-training, researching on the internet, or the training provided through Young Epilepsy as a charity that we were able to access. Having that background knowledge and that understanding of epilepsy and how it can present and how it can impact on our young people that we're teaching is really, really fundamental. And it does take that fear away. If you know that a seizure is probably not going to last forever and it's going to find a natural end at some point, it gives you that bit of relief, I suppose. No less terrifying, and they're always horrible to see. But it's good to have that background knowledge and know what to expect and how best to support those young people. The third quote there, epilepsy is a horrible condition, but these young people are so rewarding to work with. Progress can sometimes be slower, but it's so rewarding to see that light bulb moment. So I'm sure you all know what that light bulb moment is, that moment that a young person or child really clicks and understands the theory behind what they're learning and why it's important to them. As you've heard from speakers before, that can be a slow process. It can take a long time. And for the students that we work with at St. Piers, they've got some very complex medical needs and and comorbidities that really do impair their ability to learn quickly. We celebrate small steps to success. We break down our targets into very small achievable chunks that our students can definitely learn and be able to progress through. And that gives them that sense of achievement as well that is really important in building their self-confidence and self-esteem. And final quote there, it was really scary at first. My training really helped me to be confident in managing seizures and knowing what to look for. So when I first started, there was a lot of misconceptions about how to manage seizures, holding their head still or putting something in their mouth, all those very old wives' tale-y kind of things that were still very prevalent there. Thankfully, I think in the time that I've been working for Young Epilepsy and how the organisation has adapted and grown since, I think there's a much more common understanding that those things are outdated and old-fashioned and not the best practice to be using for our young people. There are much safer ways to do it and more appropriate ways to support someone if they are having a seizure. So obviously we need to understand, if we're going to be teaching these young people with epilepsy, what it is like to be in a school and have epilepsy. I think one of our speakers mentioned earlier that having empathy and trying to put yourselves into someone else's shoes, I think that was Clara actually, really lovely speech, Clara, thank you and well done on your achievements. But I think the same could be said about putting yourself in someone else's shoes and thinking what it must be like for that person to have a seizure. They don't necessarily know that it's coming. They don't necessarily even know that it's happened at the time until they've woken up, and you might be that face that they see first. So there'll be a lot of fear that goes into that as well. A lot of the students that participate in this have come from mainstream education. So they've gone through a number of years in mainstream through primary and some secondary. And unfortunately, those placements have failed because of the needs of our young people that have ended up coming to us. So some of the quotes there, I didn't like going to my old school because people laughed at me. As we've heard before as well, bullying does seem to be quite prevalent with epilepsy. And I think not necessarily just because of the epilepsy, but there's also the social side to consider as well. If a young person's missing social opportunities or interactions, that's going to be another reason that they could get bullied. If they're slightly different or seizures have been seen, that's another reason they could be slightly bullied. So there's lots of different reasons around that. I think it's really important to educate the whole school on the impact of epilepsy. I love that Clara said that it had a really positive impact, and I'm really pleased for her that that's the case. And I think it should be more common practice in mainstream schools, especially to have that kind of education around PSHE and the different conditions that they might come across, especially if they could witness a seizure. The nurse was really nice. She helped my teachers sometimes. So again, as has been mentioned, that link with medical professionals is key. And we're very lucky at St Piers. We've got a team of expert nurses and medical staff that we can lean on to support with us if need be, or if we're not sure on something. But having a nurse in school, if it can be done, it's well worth doing. They can be that first person sometimes that will be helping that young person out of it, and will have a really good grasp on their epilepsy and how it impacts on them. I always felt a bit lonely. I know that's been mentioned as well before, that isolation that can come into having epilepsy. If you don't feel that anybody understands you or really knows what you're going through, or even how to support you, it's going to feel very isolating, and that's going to have a real strong impact on your anxiety levels, your mental health in general, and it's not a nice place to be if you're feeling lonely and isolated. So as a school community, I think it's important to come together and make sure that no one's left out in that sense. Scary. I didn't know if I would be safe at my old school. So if any of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we very much look at that when we're looking at our students and their need groups. The feeling of being safe and having nutrition and water and food, they're right down the bottom, those fundamental needs that we need to be able to learn and succeed. So if you're going into an environment where you're scared or you're not sure that you're going to be safe, you're not going to be able to reach actualization and be able to really progress and learn in a good environment. Next quote there, it made me so sad. My friends got scared even if I had, my friends got scared if I had a seizure. And I know that Clara mentioned on that again earlier, so I'll keep coming back to you, Clara, sorry. So that, again, that's why I think it's really important to educate our young people, create those networks of friendship groups with the support of the young person that has the epilepsy themselves, and make sure that we're doing what we can to raise the awareness, make sure lots of different people know how to help as best we can, and to have that support group. It's really important to have a support network that our young people can talk to and open up about, and not feel ashamed or embarrassed or that they're not being understood. So it's good to have that knowledge about it, even if you don't have epilepsy yourself. And finally, then no one understood why I didn't always understand. They thought I wasn't listening. So as we know from this evening, epilepsy can come in all different shapes and forms and impact in many different ways. And I think one of the key ones that comes out a lot in mainstream education is absent seizures. They've been referred to as looking like a young person's daydreaming, or they've just zoned out, or they're not paying attention. And I think it's really important that all education professionals, understand that that is a form of seizure. That is a seizure that's happening, and that student mentally is not present in that room listening and learning at that point. Their brain is busy doing other things. It can be very difficult to miss. If you've got a large class group of 30, it can be very difficult to miss. So having an extra pair of eyes, or again, like I said, with that support network around that young person, could be really invaluable in helping them to learn and progress, or coming back to bits of learning that they've missed. So I asked the young people what a school could have done to have helped them, to make them feel better and more included in their previous environments. So if my teacher spoke to me and my mum about my seizures, so I knew that they could help me, I think that goes without saying. Communication's been mentioned so many times, and communication with parents and the young person. I mean, parents and the young people know themselves the best. We're kind of learning from them in that sense as best we can. And it's really important to keep that communication up. You'd be able to know when to differentiate your lessons more, or when to adapt a lesson. If you know a young person's had a seizure that morning, or has had a really bad night's sleep because they're epilepsy and they've still struggled to come into school, we should be able to adapt some of our learning and our expectations to suit them, and teach them in a way that's appropriate to their current needs, which may be different from them on a healthy day. I wish I didn't have to keep trying to explain to my friends. I wish they knew more about it so they weren't so scared of me. And again, I think that comes back to that raising awareness, that education of the whole school, the whole student body as well, and making sure that they're not fearful, but they know what to do. They've got the confidence to support someone that they care about, and that they're a colleague to and a peer to. So giving them the tools that they can be confident in that. And on the other side, I wish I didn't have to tell anyone so I could be normal. That feeling of normality, of wanting to come through. Again, to me, that comes across that this young person has quite low self-esteem and low confidence, because in part down to their epilepsy and what they faced in previous settings. So unfortunately, this young person does want to be seen as normal, whatever normal may be. And I think there needs to be work done with her around what normal is, and that she is normal. She's just got additional needs, as we all do in some way, shape or form. But obviously, when we're talking about that, raising the whole school profile and awareness, it is very important to include the young person in that. They might not want to be pinpointed and identified as this person has epilepsy, but it may be working with them to deliver a stronger message to the whole student body without putting the spotlight directly on them. And being able to do the same games as my friends. I think we've heard a lot about that kind of exclusion that happens with young people with epilepsy. We strive as a school to be very inclusive of our sports, of our games and everything we do. If there's a will, there's a way, as they say. And I think if you can learn about a young person, their epilepsy, how it affects them, their triggers, what care they need afterwards, you can quite easily risk assess and plan around those difficulties to make sure you're being as inclusive as you can. Some of our students, their favourite activity is crate building, where they're going up 10 meters high on crates and having to do teamwork and support each other. All very safe, all ropes and helmets attached, but a lot of places wouldn't allow that to happen on the fear of a seizure happening. But because we know what we're doing, we know what we're talking about, and we know how to support that young person, we can take those managed risks and help them to take those managed risks, identifying what could go wrong, but what could go right and be really valuable for them too. So just some of the main key points that I've picked up about teaching young people with epilepsy is understanding the individual child or the young person with epilepsy and their seizure protocol. So get to know them, take that time to really build a positive relationship, so they trust you, they know that you know what you're talking about, and they know that you can keep them safe as well. Most students will have a seizure protocol at some point, whether that's when to administer medication or when further emergency services might be needed. So it's always good to make sure you know that. Attending training to develop your own confidence in managing epilepsy. Like I said earlier, it's been fundamental in the majority of our teachers' careers at Young Epilepsy at St. Piers School, in giving them that confidence. It will always be scary. There will always be scary moments, and seizures are never nice to witness or to be around. but you can manage them. You can keep that young person safe, and you can really help them to bounce back and have that recovery time before they come back to their learning. Raising awareness, so that those whole school approaches, and it links in with point 3 there as well, of teaching other students about epilepsy and involving those with epilepsy as much as possible. So generally speaking, it's nights like tonight, I'm so glad to see so many of you have joined us, that we're raising that awareness of epilepsy and giving that giving it the light it needs and the support it needs. And like I said earlier, taking time to build positive and trusting relationships is fundamental in what we do. And that goes without saying for all young people, let alone those with additional needs such as epilepsy. So it is about taking that time, getting to know them and making sure you've got a really good grasp and an understanding of their individual needs, being inclusive, not exclusive. Thank you very much.
Great, Danny. Thank you very much. Really important insight. Our next speaker is Lisa O'Brien, who's the head of health at Young Epilepsy and also an epilepsy nurse. And we've heard a number of references to the nursing profession and how helpful it can be for kids with epilepsy. So over to you, Lisa.
Hi, thank you very much for asking me to present today. I hope I keep it all in, but I'm very passionate about working as an epilepsy nurse. And I'm really fortunate because I work at Young Epilepsy, so I support Danny and his team at the school, St Piers, but I also work for Young Epilepsy as the national charity. So, let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah. So I want to just kind of explain what the role of the epilepsy nurse specialist is. We're really lucky, we work across different fields such as adults, paediatrics and learning disabilities. And we can kind of support within the school environment. I think we need to be very clear though that there aren't enough epilepsy nurses around. And we cannot support everybody with epilepsy across the country. And some people don't even have access to an epilepsy nurse. Also, the current epilepsy nurses working within the NHS have large caseloads and do not have capacity necessarily to provide the support that is so needed within schools. Epilepsy nurses are essential component in epilepsy services for all children diagnosed with epilepsy, and it's an incredibly rewarding role which ensures that people with epilepsy have consistent care, and we're often referred to as the glue that holds together the social, clinical, educational and emotional dimensions that people with epilepsy must navigate. So I tried to put down what I do as an epilepsy nurse, and this kind of changes on a day-to-day basis, looking at all the different things we do, and it's really hard to put it all down, and this is forever changing. So my role currently involves all of these and more. I would say a lot of what I do is raising awareness, education and training is a key part, and being that first point of contact for families, teachers and the wider community with concerns around epilepsy. So epilepsy nurse is often the first point of contact for patients and families, and they feel more comfortable speaking with a nurse a lot of the time. We're able to review management of epilepsy, offering practical advice and help in management of side effects of medication and the impact of living with epilepsy. We can support with epilepsy medication reviews, making adjustments where necessary. We can refer patients to other health professionals and services. We are also there to listen and answer questions and concerns. We also provide resources, so lots of information and literature, and direct people to trusted sites. So this can be quite confusing, the care plan. There are lots of different care plans out there that support people with epilepsy within education. And this is often can be quite confusing. And I think that a lot of the time people refer to different care plans, meaning different things. So I've tried to kind of encompass what the care plans mean. So there is an epilepsy care plan, and this is a comprehensive plan that is agreed between the person with epilepsy, their family carers, and primary and secondary care, to the health professionals. And we often refer to it as the roadmap of the condition and its management. It's reviewed annually, and we look at seizures, what the seizures are like, what emergency medication is needed and when it is required. We also will look at different components of the life cycle, so how it affects in school, what about driving, and implications like that all are on the epilepsy care plan, and it's reviewed annually. Then there's the individual health care plan, which Catherine discussed in her presentation earlier. And this is completed in partnership between the school, the parents, pupil and health professionals. And they take a lot of the epilepsy care plan and draw that into the individual healthcare plan, but they are different. These are created to ensure that schools know how to support the child effectively and to provide clarity about what needs to be done, when and by whom. The school is responsible for its implementation. It is required even if seizures are adequately controlled. So it basically ensures that everyone knows what to do and when, and it is reviewed annually or more often if needs change. And then the educational healthcare plan is a legally binding document, and it gives assurances over a child's education, health and social care needs when extra support is needed in an education setting. It is said, so if it says what needs to happen, then it is going to happen. And it's for families and professionals to focus on outcomes they would like to see and how these will be met. And again, this is reviewed annually. So a lot of the time people talk about these, but not necessarily all of them are available, but they should be. And as Catherine said in previous studies, it showed that so many people do not have individual healthcare plans. So we provide training as part of our epilepsy nurse role. And as I've said, it's not always possible for the epilepsy nurse to provide the training, but it is an essential component. And we've, there's been lots of research that proves the outcome and the positive outcomes of good training and how that affects quality of life. Training should be for parents, the person themselves, other students within school, the teachers, and it should encompass everything from the seizures, how to recognise seizures, how to record them, how to manage them, seizure first aid, how to give emergency medication, and any other treatments such as the vagal nerve stimulator. And it is part of the role that I really enjoy. I feel it helps me go out there and raise awareness of epilepsy and the implications epilepsy has on a person's life. And it ensures that people can access education. I provide training to schools and colleges and universities, as well as other residential provisions as well. We also provide lots of information and advice. So this can be as simple as the safety and first aid, which we provide in training, supporting education. It can go from right at the beginning, so supporting a family through the understanding and coping with the diagnosis of epilepsy, the young person with their epilepsy, making them aware of alternative treatments and how they can access those, looking at employment, recreational activities, looking at how we can best support them with safety advice, ensuring that they get the most out of their life, giving them every opportunity. And as Clara said, epilepsy doesn't define a person, it is part of something they have, but they are much bigger than that. And so what we want to do as epilepsy nurses is get that message out there. It's to support the person to live as a rewarding life as possible, and not letting their epilepsy impact. So as I've said, it's such a rewarding job. I love what I do. I could talk about it for hours, and I'm sure lots of people who've heard me talk say that that's what I do a lot of. But these are just some of the people that we impact on and how they feel about us. You know, someone recently said that we were lifesavers. You know, if we hadn't been at the end of the phone or able to see them at short notice, you know, they wouldn't know what they would do. You know, it's being there for the parents, the actual patients themselves, the young children, being at the end of the phone for supporting school staff, going in and helping them kind of navigate epilepsy and how we can improve the service so they can offer a service for a child to access education and get everything they can out of the school time. So what do we offer at Young Epilepsy? I'd be failing if I didn't explain what I could provide you. And I'm one person, so I can't provide it to everyone all in one go. But we do offer training to educational establishments. We go into schools and colleges. We provide epilepsy awareness, but we also provide emergency medication training, how to identify seizures, how the seizures impact on an individual and how that can affect their learning. We also go in and provide sessions for classes themselves to raise awareness to them around having somebody within their class environment or in their school who has seizures, and first aid for young people to be able to manage a seizure if they are faced with it, whether that's in school or at home or out in the community. We also offer general and bespoke support. So that might be accessing an epilepsy nurse specialist to support with care plan writing and reviewing cases, and also liaising with specialist teams. We also run clinics in the community to support those who don't have access to an epilepsy nurse specialist, and that can be both remote and in person, and that will help the stretched NHS provision currently out there. So that was me in a nutshell. I did try and keep it short and sweet. But this is my contact details. So, you know, if you want to get in touch and find out more about how we can support you, then I'm there to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Very, very important for young people with epilepsy. And as you say, Lisa, not enough of you. Our next speaker is Sophie Bennett. Sophie's a clinical psychologist, and she's going to talk a little bit about supporting children with epilepsy who have behavioural, emotional difficulties or mental health problems. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me in this webinar. It's been really interesting listening to all of the other speakers as well. I want to say that we've also got Izzy Stokes, who works with me in our team, and she has previously worked in mental health in schools as an education wellbeing practitioner. So Izzy will also be around with me for answering any questions. So I don't know if I can control this now. It doesn't seem to be clicking through. It is clicking through now. We've already heard, I think, that mental health problems in epilepsy are very common. But what is, I suppose, good news in terms of the point of treatment for those mental health problems is that the most common mental health problems in children with epilepsy are the same as the most common in children who don't have epilepsy. So those are things like anxiety, worries, depression and low mood, behaviour problems, and often those might occur together in one young person and in the context of other difficulties like developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities. And the reason that I say that in some ways it's good news that the most common in those in epilepsy are the same as the ones as children who don't have epilepsy is because we actually have a really good evidence base for mental health interventions in children and young people. So we've got thousands of research papers showing the efficacy of standard evidence-based interventions for mental health difficulties in children and young people. What we don't know at this point is whether those same treatments are safe and effective in children with epilepsy. And we've done some preliminary work in our team to suggest that they are, and that includes reviews of other people's studies. But we're doing a big ongoing study called the MICE study, which you might have heard of, mental health in children, intervention for children with epilepsy, where we're looking to investigate that question. But until the results of that study are known, our view and the view of our team is that there isn't really any evidence that those same interventions that we use for children and young people who don't have epilepsy don't work in children with epilepsy. And actually, coupled with the fact that although we've heard that epilepsy can impact in many ways on young people's mental health, on their well-being, self-esteem, many of the underlying causes may also not be directly related to seizures themselves. So this comes from research from Oxford, from another team, their Health Talk videos. This quote says, the relationship between epilepsy and depression was complex for young people, not just feeling down about the diagnosis. Most people who had anxiety or depression said it was connected to their situations, such as problems in the family or losing a relative. And so that's really important, because actually what you can see is that those difficulties might be the same difficulties that other young people who don't have epilepsy are experiencing. And so with that in mind, what I want to talk through is the standard ways that we would treat anxiety, low mood and behaviour problems, those most common mental health difficulties in children and young people. So this is not specific to children and young people who have epilepsy. This is what research evidence would suggest that we should be supporting young people with, who, whether or not they have epilepsy. So for behaviour problems, these active ingredients are probably things that many people in the audience, if not all people in the audience, have heard of before. So those are things like one-to-one time, so scheduling in special time where you spend time just with the young, a parent spends time just with the young person on activities that the young person has chosen. Praise, active ignoring of behaviours that we don't want to see. Effective instruction, so learning how to give instructions in the most effective way that's likely to result in a positive response from a young person. Rewards, so things like star charts, sticker charts, and timeout. So I imagine that most people in the audience are familiar with those strategies, whether or not it's working with a young person who has epilepsy. And I think for mental health practitioners, the key to working with young people with epilepsy using these different strategies is really to personalise it based on the young person and the family that you're working with. So no standard interventions are they're not supposed to be delivered in exactly the same way for each individual person. You want to personalize it and individualize it. And so just as an example of that, you can't probably see the text, but this is a young person's reward chart that they developed for themselves with their parents. This young person really, really likes dogs. And so they cut out lots of pictures of different dogs, and they would be able to put a picture. They took a picture of a dog from a jar when they earned a reward and put it on the chart. And then for a certain number of dog pictures, that earned them a certain reward. And then this is just an example of the praise intervention taken from the MindEd website, which I will explain a little bit more about at the end. Hopefully you can hear this and people will let me know if you can't hear it. I have pressed play, Bhavna. I don't know if it's just slow.
So, Michelle, if I say to you, thanks ever such a lot, really appreciate it. Well done. What does that feel like? It's nice, but I don't know really what you're talking about. Absolutely. Yeah, so it's kind of nice, but you've got absolutely no idea what I'm talking about at all. Okay? And so if we want our kids to do a behaviour again, what is it we've got to do? Yeah, absolutely, we've got to tell them why we're praising them. So, good boy for sitting quietly, good boy for playing nicely with your brother, or oh, well done for eating your tea. You know, Mommy loves it when you eat your tea. Sort of thing. So actually, in the business, we call it specific label praise. So it's giving a label to what they're doing. All right, so it's really important to tell them. You're absolutely right. Because they've got no idea. Okay, and when do you think is the best time to praise them? 3 weeks after they've
pretty soon after.
Yeah, absolutely. The sooner the better. You know, it's kind of for them to make the link between the behaviour and the praise, especially if we want them to do it again. It's really important we do it as soon as we can. So if I say to you, Laura, well, thanks for coming today. I really appreciate it. And you know what? It's your contribution to the group is great, and you know, you're really open and honest. It's really good. Well done. What's that though?
It doesn't feel like you mean it.
Well, I'm praising you, aren't I? And I'm being specific, telling you why.
Yeah.
So, Michelle, if I say to you, thanks ever such a lot, really appreciate it. Well done.
I'm trying to pause it, Bhavna, but it doesn't seem to want to pause. There we go. Thank you. So I'm just illustrating that. That's actually a video that we have used with parents with young people with epilepsy to illustrate that concept of praise. And then we'll work with parents around praising specific behaviours for specific difficulties. And I think, again, that just shows that we're not using different or special strategies for children with epilepsy. We're using those same standard strategies that many, if not most, or all of the audience will be familiar with. So similarly, thinking about anxiety, we talk about learning about anxiety. We then build a hierarchy, or we call it a ladder, as this illustration. Basically steps along the way to the feared situation. So gradually building up a young person's experience of being in their feared situation and learning that their perhaps feared outcome doesn't happen. Then exposing them to that feared situation. Rewarding them for their efforts in trying. And potentially coupling that with some strategies around different ways of thinking to support that. So again, just got a brief video of how we might introduce this concept to a family, and hopefully this one works too.
Anyone can experience anxiety. Some situations make our heart race, our hands shake. We might get jelly legs and find it difficult to concentrate. Anxiety evolved to keep us safe. It's our body's natural alarm system telling us when to run away or to stand and fight in dangerous situations. This is the flight or fight response. Anxiety can become a problem when there isn't actually anything to worry about, or when our fear outweighs the risks. Going to a party, sitting an exam, or going somewhere new can be enough to make us feel anxious, which can change the way we think and how we behave. Usually these feelings don't last long, and we start to feel more confident over time. Sometimes anxiety gets in the way of anyone can experience anxiety.
That started again, but I think that you get the idea. Again, this is a video that we do use with young people and with families to explain anxiety. This is available online so Think Ninja is actually an app that people, I think some trusts have access to this app. It depends where you are in the country. And then thinking about those exposure tasks. So this is an example of a ladder, and this is for a fear of dogs, just to illustrate the concept. So you might start with somebody looking at just pictures of dogs for 10 minutes, building up in the middle to maybe going over to the neighbour's house and looking at a dog, but while the dog's on a lead and is quite far away. Then they may be moving the dog a bit closer, maybe being able to pet eventually the dog once you're comfortable with the lower steps, before finally going up to a pet store and interacting with lots of dogs. So that's one example. In a school setting, we often work with young people who might be worried about speaking in class or answering questions in class. And again, maybe we might start with answering a question in front of a small group of people and building up to slightly bigger groups, maybe in less scary classes or where they know the answer to the question, building up to when they're not sure they know the answer to the question, but they'd like to have a go, and perhaps building up to having to give a talk in front of their class. And then thinking about low mood. So we often will monitor young people's mood and their activity to look at the relationship between those two. We learn about depression and what low mood is for young people, what it looks like. We might do some problem solving. So often young people and adults who have low mood might struggle to solve everyday problems in their lives. So we give them a structured way to do that. You can see that this is all quite active, and it's very strategy focused in terms of those evidence-based interventions for mental health difficulties. More doing, less talking. We might often do activity scheduling. So this is based around the idea that when you're low in mood, you may not feel like doing activities, but actually when you do activities, you feel better in mood. So doing the activities, even if your mood, even if you don't feel like doing them. Relaxation, which I'm sure you've all heard of before, and presenting a positive self. So that's kind of being, I guess, active at school and inviting people to have conversations with you, for example, that again might reinforce a positive mood. And cognitive strategies, which I'm going to illustrate in a second. So this is one strategy we might use with low mood called changing blue thoughts, and blue thoughts being the ones that are blaming yourself, looking for bad news, unhappy guessing and exaggerating. And we help young people to recognize when they might have a blue thought, but also come up with a more realistic, true thought. So those are kind of whistle-stop tour of strategies, but for young people, for any kind of teachers that are in the audience, as well as parents, I wanted to show you this MindEd website. So this is a really fantastic resource. It's got lots and lots and lots of fantastic training materials, and it's been developed by NHS Health Education England. The resources and the training are basically put together by all of the leading experts in the country in their various areas. So in line with what I said at the beginning, there's no specific training on this MindEd website for young people with epilepsy specifically, but what there is lots of training in those common mental health problems, which we know are the mental health problems that young people with epilepsy are most likely to have too. Izzy's just joined me for when we come on to answering any questions at the end, but also about some other resources. So these are some self-help books that we often recommend parents and young people. They're again based on these evidence-based strategies. So one around fears and worries, one around behaviour difficulties, and one around depression. There's also a matching parents guide for depression with this book. These are things that if there are parents in the audience that you could also use whilst your person potentially is on the waiting list for support for their mental health. And then in terms of further support, I'm going to give you over to Izzy to explain some of this, but this is where you might go if you think that either you, a young person that you are supporting as a parent or a teacher, might have difficulties with their mental health. So Izzy, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I think one of the places that you can go to for further support is obviously speaking to your GP or the medical team. Another place is school. So I am an education mental health practitioner, and it was a new role brought in by the government in 2019. And education mental health practitioners form these new teams in schools called mental health support teams. So I think at the moment there are about 500 teams across the UK, and every year there are more that are going into schools. And they offer one-to-one support, group support, workshop training around the topics that Sophie just covered. So CBT topics, anxiety, depression, behaviour as well. So it might be that the school you're in, you can access that team, or if not, there might be an equivalent support as well, like a school nursing team, for example. And you've also got the senior mental health lead, who's identified and helps that mental health support team in the school. And other professionals like the SENCO or the safeguarding lead, the pastoral lead, the school nurse, and things like that. So do speak to school. It might be accessing the single point of access in your area. So if you go onto the NHS website, you can find different areas that can help you with your mental health, and different helplines and different support for your emotional well-being and your mental health. And then here are some other useful resources as well. So Young Minds have a free parent helpline and a free chat service, which is helpful for parents. Family Lives is an organisation that helps with parenting support that you can access, and that includes free courses that you can access, so you can have a look at that. And Minded as well, is what Sophie just showed the video from. It's a really good resource that shows lots of training and different videos too.
Brilliant. Thank you, Izzy. So very quickly, I guess our main summary from that would just be that there's no reason that because a child has epilepsy that they should not be able to access the same mental health supports that other children and young people are able to access in your area. Speak to as many professionals as you can that are working with you if you are concerned about your mental health, to be able to be signposted, referred to the right sources of support. Colin, thank you.
Thank you very much, Izzy. Thank you very much, Sophie. Very practical help there. And, you know, a number of the questions we've got in the Q&A have, you know, focused on that aspect of where do I actually go to seek help. So that's really good, Izzy. You know, and GPs, paediatricians, schools, everybody can provide support. It's very important to work with the team that you're currently supporting you. Our next speaker is Lisa Thurston, who's the project coordinator for youth development and support at Young Epilepsy. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Colin. Hello, everyone, and thank you to all the very inspirational speakers. A bit of a hard act to follow. Quick bit of background about me. It says there I am a project coordinator. I work for Young Epilepsy's Youth Development and Support Service, specifically on the training and resources that we can offer to schools. I'm also a parent of a young person with epilepsy. My son was first diagnosed with epilepsy 18 years ago, so I've got a fair amount of experience from that point of view. And I've also worked in school governance for the last 20 years, so I've got a bit of an idea of the legal requirement for schools to support young people as well. Now, hopefully, the technology is going to mean that I can just move on to the next slide. Look at that. Okay, so as has already been said, Young Epilepsy is a national charity, and the department that I work for is part of the national work that the charity do. The Youth Development and Support Service delivers their work through three key areas, and that is support, inclusion, and engagement and participation. Is this going to, oh, what have I done there? There we go. I don't know if I'm controlling this or someone else, but anyway, here we go. I'm on the screen that I was expecting to be. Catherine spoke a little bit earlier about a resource that we have got. This is a free online guide for schools. So it is its own website, and it is a comprehensive information resource. It's something that can be used to educate school staff. It's also very helpful for parents to be able to work with the schools. And it can, when I say it can be used to educate them, you can go on there and look at all the information. If you don't know anything about epilepsy, you can learn a lot from the guide, but it can also be used as a reference resource so that schools can go back to it. So if you have got a new pupil who's arriving with a diagnosis of epilepsy, or actually if one of your pupils who has epilepsy has had some sort of change in diagnosis or seizure, you can have a look on here and see what information you can find there. It's written in non-medical accessible language. This means it is actually suitable for all education staff, and that's right the way across the board from a midday supervisor up to a chief executive officer of a multi-academy trust. So something in there, hopefully, that anybody who's involved in any way with children and young people who have got epilepsy in an education setting can actually access. And it's basically split into 3 sections. The first is the key elements of support. The second one is epileptic seizures. And the last one is the bit we've heard a lot about today, which is the bit that a lot of people don't always get. And that's the impact that epilepsy has on young people. So there's the website reference there. And hopefully I'm going to be able to go on to the next slide. So included in the guide are a lot of downloadable resources. So not only is the information there, so you can share the link with all your staff in your school and they can access the information. There are also some downloadable resources. There's the template medical conditions policy, which, as Catherine said, for a mainstream school in England, that's a statutory requirement that your school should have a medical conditions policy. We actually encourage schools to publish this on their website. It's not a statutory requirement for it to be published at the moment, but it's a very good, it would be good practice if it was on there, because it's useful then all staff know exactly where it is and also parents. There's various infographics. So there is the seizure first aid poster, which you can see here. So that would just give a basic first aid. So that can be printed off and put into classrooms or into staff rooms. There's also a poster available on there, which is about how you would record possible seizures posters. There's also template forms, so a witnessing a seizure record form, really important if a member of staff witnesses a seizure, that you have some sort of record of that, that you can share with the young person and the parents, and also potentially their medical team. And there's also a form that you can download, which is about recording the use of emergency medication. A lot of local authorities have very set guidelines around storage of emergency medications in schools, because some of the emergency medications are controlled drugs. So it's always worth checking out with your local authority exactly what their guidelines are there. So the other thing that is there is a downloadable template individual healthcare plan, which is something you've heard quite a lot about today. And I'm just going to quickly show you that's essentially part of what the template individual healthcare plan looks like. And I've highlighted here this bit, which is the bit that lots of people sometimes forget about. And that is about the impact that the young person's epilepsy, their seizures, and indeed their medication can have on their learning behaviour and their emotions. And so that's there for you to be able to record the information of what the impact is on those different things, and also be able to record what support needs to be put in place for that young person. Other bits there that it says that should be included in there, all of that is important, but one of the things that I would also pick up on is the clear communication protocol. Now, Lisa has spoken about this, Joe spoke about this earlier. This is really important. It's important for the school to communicate any changes they've seen in the pupil or student with the family, and it's also really important that the family keep the school up to date. I was very lucky as a parent. I had a really good communication process with my son's school, and as Joe was saying about earlier, I just emailed them the entire time. But I know when he left school and I sent an email to the head to say thank you so much for being able to support him, I actually got an email back to say we couldn't have done it without you as well. So it's all about teamwork. That support in school is all about teamwork between the healthcare professionals and the school, the parents and the young people, and all of that can be put on this essential document. Okay, the other thing that has been spoken about a lot, and I think probably is one of the things that a lot of people might want to know about, is actually how the education professionals in the schools can get the training about epilepsy. So Young Epilepsy currently offer free online training. It's epilepsy awareness training, but it does cover the main bits that are listed down there. So key facts about seizure management, the wider impact of epilepsy, and one thing that is on this course, which is also in the guide for schools, are descriptions of the different types of seizures that a young person may present with. And also with those there are illustrations. So as people have said, not every seizure is what people would call the TV fit, the one that you might see portrayed on the television. They're not all tonic-clonics. They're not all going to suddenly collapse to the floor and convulse. Sometimes they literally, you wouldn't know they were having a seizure. But if they have an absent seizure, then they're actually unconscious for a few seconds. Some people wouldn't even know they've had them, but obviously that's going to have a big impact on the young person. So all that information is in our free online training course. There is an email address down there. So if you are interested in being able to access that, then please email there and you will get all the information about how to register for that training. So we also offer face-to-face training. So our fantastic youth support workers are able to deliver face-to-face training. And thankfully, one of the good things that has come out of COVID is that we've all worked out how you can do things via Zoom or Microsoft Teams. So at the moment, we can actually deliver that training anywhere across the UK because we can deliver it virtually. So this is still awareness training, but it can be tailored a little bit more. So it can be delivered to a group of, say, 30 staff, but it might be that a school has come to us. A lot of the staff have done the free online training, but actually they say we've got a specific child with a specific type of epilepsy, and we'd just like to know a little bit more information. So that's something that we do offer. There's an email address down here that you can email to. There is a charge for that, but actually that kind of gets worked out when we're actually talking with you. And as Lisa was saying earlier, we can also offer emergency medication training. It says there it's delivered by our nurse consultant, but obviously it's our nurse consultant, Lisa, who was on earlier. But again, if you email that training email address, we can send you further information. And the other thing that we do in our area, our youth support workers are able to support children, young people, families and schools in various different ways. I'm not going to run through everything there because we are overrunning, and there's an opportunity for people to find out more. We've currently got online group sessions that are being run for young people, but there are also different programs which can be accessed. So anyone can refer a child or a young person. So most of the referrals actually come from schools or epilepsy nurses. But again, there's an email address there. If you think that's something that might be useful for you, please email and you will be sent the relevant information. So very quickly, what's next? We are planning on updating our online training. So it is there at the moment. It's a bit of an old course. The content is still very relevant and very useful. It just doesn't look quite as snazzy as a course that might have been written a bit more recently. But that's our next thing. We're actually actively working on that to get that online training updated, just so you get a little bit of a better user experience. But at the moment, we are getting a lot of staff who are doing that training and feeding back to say it's very useful. So please have a go at it now, and then you can come back at a later date and try it when it's all been updated. We're also hoping to expand the youth support service work to be able to offer information sessions for parents. And the other thing, which will be a bit further down the line, but coming out of the training and out of the guide for schools, we are working towards setting up an epilepsy positive scheme. And that will be almost like a kite mark, really, for education organisations who can actually work alongside us to make sure that they have got the best support in place that they can have for children and young people with epilepsy. And then there'll be some way that we can actually recognise that. And then, you know, that's what's coming. So it's all very exciting. And that's it. I certainly don't think they kept the best till last. It's been very humbling and a privilege, actually, to have been able to take part in this. So thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and very important information there and very important and useful resources. We're coming to the end of our webinar. we've gone a little bit over time, but I will address a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. Just to say as well, we're currently, as Lisa said, updating our training materials for schools. And what we would like in terms of updating those materials is input from young people with epilepsy, caregivers of people with epilepsy, and also school staff. So if you would like to contribute and help us to make those materials the best they can be, just look at on the slide here is a QR code, so you can just scan that in and you can express your interest to participate in interviews or focus groups where you will tell us a little bit about what you think school staff should know about epilepsy. So I'll leave that slide up there. In terms of the questions, I'm going to very briefly sort of summarize the types of questions which have come in. One of the questions that have come in, or some of the questions that have come in, have been around the distinction between EHCP, IHP, so Education, Health and Care Plan and Individual Healthcare Plan. All children with epilepsy should have an IHP, an Individual Healthcare Plan, but all children with epilepsy won't have an EHCP because that's dependent on the learning needs of the child. But both the research I talked about and Catherine has mentioned about an IHP, that all children with epilepsy should have one, but that's currently not the case. I don't know, Catherine or Lisa or Brian, if you want to say anything about that, and what's the process for developing an individual healthcare plan?
Hi, sorry, Catherine, do you want to start? Because I'm stuck in the gym because of the fire alarm.
So yeah, as Colin said, for an individual healthcare plan, that's something that we'd expect all children with epilepsy to have. If you haven't got one in place, or if you think you might have one, but it might be a bit out of date, contact your school's SENCO, as they should be able to, if they're not able to help you, they should be able to direct you to the person who would be able to help, and they can help get the ball rolling there. And on Young Epilepsy's Guide for Schools, we've also got some template individual healthcare plans there to help you think about what should be included. Yeah, so hopefully that's useful.
That's very helpful. Another question referred to seizure alarms or seizure monitoring devices. So I wonder, maybe Lisa or Brian or Helen maybe could talk a little bit about that. Someone was asking, could we recommend any seizure alarms or any monitoring devices?
I'm happy to take that. But the thing is, there are many devices on the market, although there's nothing that's formally been assessed as being validated to determine, there are certain ones that may detect generalized tonic-clonic seizures. There are others that may detect very isolated focal seizures, but none have actually been validated to the extent that we are able to recommend a certain device. Some are more convenient than others, for example, wristwatches or other devices. But as I said, it's very difficult for us to recommend, and often it's trying to determine what may be the best for the type of seizure the individual's having. And many of them are actually designed for overnight detection rather than necessarily throughout the 24 hours. And most of them detect rather than actually predict. So it is quite difficult. And as I said, it's very difficult for us to recommend one over above another.
Thank you, Helen. And another area which has come up a little bit in the chat is about seeking help for mental health problems. So basically, first point of contact. I know Izzy and Sophie have talked a little bit about that, but if I could go back to you both, Izzy and Sophie, if a parent is worried about their child and thinking, my child is depressed, my child might have anxiety, and another parent had mentioned developmental coordination disorder, so we also mentioned ADHD. What sort of steps do you think in the school context or even at home, what should a parent be doing?
Sure. So I'll let Izzy also add to this, but I think the main thing is to let professionals know. I think you as parents know your young person the best, and if you are concerned about their mental health, then that concern is likely valid. So please talk to your child's GP. You can talk to the SENCO at school, but you could also talk to the class teacher, whoever you feel most comfortable in having that discussion with. And I think I've answered that question to somebody else, that asking them to refer your child for further assessment or support. it may take a long time, unfortunately, to get that support. So referrals to children and young people's mental health services, there can be quite long waiting lists. There can be very long waiting lists depending on the area, and that's why I put some of those self-help resources up as well. So those are the kind of based on the evidence-based strategies, and so those are potentially things that you can start working with, or your young person can start working with before you're seen by mental health services. But that's not to say that you shouldn't be accessing the support or able to access the support. People like Izzy, so education wellbeing practitioners, there may be shorter wait lists for them. And I don't know, Izzy, is there anywhere else that you think parents should be going to if they have concerns?
Yeah, say the same. I think GP, talking to your school, so the SENCO or the pastoral lead, or if they've got a senior mental health lead and a mental health support team who can help. The NHS website is often quite helpful as well, and has kind of helplines and links to other resources that you can access. Someone in the chat as well, I noticed, recommended Kooth and Chat Health. So often there are other platforms that you can access kind of self-help guides whilst you're waiting. And like Sophie said as well, children and mental health services like CAMS as well are useful to access too. But yeah, quite long waiting lists sometimes.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Izzy. I think one of the questions was specifically about developmental coordination disorder. So in that regard, I think talking to the child's paediatrician or GP will be best. It is a condition which is not that well known compared to some other conditions we're talking about tonight. But I think it's very important, if your child has coordination problems, to talk to the child's professional, medical professional as your first point of contact. I think that's it for tonight, everybody. I'm so grateful for everyone who could participate, and it's been really great to hear both the professions, but particularly young Clara and Joe talking about epilepsy. So thank you very much, and a very good night to you. And just remember, the recording will be available on the Young Epilepsy website soon. Thank you very much.